Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, his church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Hi, this is Gabe Lyons, and welcome to another edition of the Q Ideas podcast. I'm so glad that you are learning with us today, and that's what we do here, constantly trying to stay curious, think well, advance good. And today we're going to learn about such a fundamental principle and idea that, unfortunately, I think a lot of people have forgotten, and especially in America right now. We've forgotten this idea of the freedom of conscience. What is that? What are conscience rights? You know, we don't talk a lot about it. We talk about free speech, free association, but in this current moment where we're seeing a lot more dialogue go forward about people being forced to do things, maybe even against their will or against their conscience or against the way they think things ought to be, how should we think about that as Christians? At our most recent Culture Summit, we invited Becket Fund's Vice President and Executive Director, Montse Alvarado, to talk to us about freedom of conscience. And why does this idea matter? How is it the same or different than freedom of religion? And why should we think well about this topic? And I think you're going to find it pertinent as we consider in the days ahead the conversations that we must have about when is it okay for someone to usurp a person's conscience.
Hello, hello. Yeah, this is a really important right. It's fundamental, just like you heard described by the wonderful Gabe, who I'm so honored to share this stage with. And but it's a challenge, and it's a challenge to love. But before I tell you why it's a challenge to love, let me tell you what freedom of conscience is and why it matters. Freedom of conscience, as you heard, is part of this bigger concept, freedom of religion. And freedom of religion is the key that unlocks every other freedom that we have in this country. Because what could be more sacred than what's in your heart, than what's in your mind? What should be more respected and untouchable than what you've freely developed and freely discovered in your search for God? Freedom of conscience is often called freedom of thought. It's your right to believe. But it's only one of three pieces that make up religious freedom: believing, forming, and acting. Your ability to believe, to form yourself and teach others, and to be inspired by that belief to act, to go out in the world and to do something in society. I've spent the last 12 years defending religious freedom for people of all beliefs and no belief at all, because it's a human right. So how do these two words, religious freedom, come together to encompass all this stuff? Let's start with the first one, religious. If I were talking to a monolithic group of people who all believe the same thing and confess one system of belief, this would be easy. We get that religion thing. But it's not easy. We live in America, in a country where less than half of its citizens belong to a synagogue, a temple, a church, or a community of faith. Most people, when they think of that first word, they think of organized religion. But that's wrong. It's myopic. And it forgets the importance of free will, religion, love of God, freely given, freely accepted, and your ability to change your mind or to doubt. Religious, in the phrase religious freedom, is this important reminder about what we believe about human nature. It's not about who God is or if God is. It's about who we are and what our purpose is on this earth. We're not just beings floating around with no purpose and no calling. We're individuals with our eyes fixed on the far horizon, asking these big questions about who we are and why we are. Millennials always talk about existential dread and how it comes in the middle of the night. Yes, ask those questions. It's there for a reason. Religion then becomes a declaration. That word is the declaration of who we are as human beings and in our search for truth. And then the second part, freedom, it seems easy. It's a little more direct though. It's not just a lofty concept. It compels us to actually do something. It's an action. Freedom to believe, to act, to search, to find, and then to do something with what we find. Many people have tried to use religious freedom as a tool to silence other people, claiming that religious freedom is your right not to be exposed to things that you disagree with. And they advocate to limit freedom of religion and freedom of conscience, using the phrase freedom of worship, to minimize this broader, fuller right, this broader, full citizenship into this tiny, tiny little thing, telling you to check your religion at the door when you go to work and when you are a part of civil society. Freedom from religion instead of freedom of religion. That's an important distinction that you shouldn't forget. And in using this freedom of religion and this truth, we develop a perspective, a conscience. Our religion is a lens that we apply to every single aspect of our lives. It motivates everything that we do. And having that lens, it demands courage. That we live our lives motivated by this belief that we've found. Let me tell you a story. When Armando Valladares was 23 years old, he followed his conscience and he ended up in Castro's gulag. Living in Castro's Cuba, Armando refused to do something that seemed very small. He refused to say a few words, "I'm with Fidel." Even after years of torture and watching many of his fellow fighters die, either in body or in spirit, he would still refuse to say those words. Because if he had just said those words, the torture would have stopped. He'd been released. And that told him everything he needed to know. They didn't keep him in jail for 22 years, 8 years in solitary confinement because those words meant nothing. Saying those words would constitute a spiritual suicide. It didn't matter that he was tortured for years, eventually losing his ability to walk, partially losing his ability to see. His soul was free, and he would give up everything for that. And the words he wrote in his memoir, they feel even more true today. Sometimes your freedom is not taken away at gunpoint. It's done with a little piece of paper. One seemingly meaningless rule at a time. One small silencing at a time. And in the midst of this persecution and imprisonment, Armando Valladares, he practiced his faith and his conscience. It was alive. You see, people aren't interested in what you do. They're interested in why you do it. And so that why needs to be really clear in your life. Armando Valladares, he was a political prisoner, and his aggressors knew what they were doing. They knew that they could control everything about his life, but he knew that they couldn't control what's here and what's here. But what about us? Those of us on the outside, those of us who are out from under the thumb of coercion, what should we do? Christians and people of faith have a very important role to play in protecting and defending religious freedom for everybody, that search for truth. As Christians, you and I are called to make a decision. Do we really believe the incarnational reality of our faith, that we're made in the image and likeness of God and we're called to fulfillment in what we believe? If so, then religious freedom has one more important characteristic, and that's humility. There is nothing that I can do or say to bring someone to Christ. I can't force that. It's their choice. Religious freedom is not a political tactic or an evangelistic tool. It's not a political football. Religious freedom is a basic human need, and the government should not co-opt it or use it for its own means. But it's also not an evangelistic tool. Religious freedom is not a means to an end. It's just a door. It's our common agreement to have these conversations, and it's our common agreement that these conversations are true and good and valuable. Often, that's the piece that's most misunderstood. The only tool in our toolkit is humility. Well, humility and love. Because if you want to have these discussions based on our common humanity, your conscience will inspire you to do these good things. These good things, they're motivated by love. That's true evangelization. It's loving well. It means overcoming your own fear, your own timidity, your own fear of rejection, because Christ in the other person is so much more important than anything else, than any risk, any hypothetical cost. So then how do you practice freedom of conscience? How do you defend religious freedom too? Use it. I love the story of the Apostle Paul because On its face, his life is a story of what our country believes about religious freedom. Individuals come to believe on their own terms. No government can force you and no government can stop you. Writing from prison and house arrest, Paul lit souls on fire. And his public conversion reminds us that we don't know when that moment of truth, that search for truth is going to peak. We don't know that. But we know that that search and that moment has to be protected, no matter how wild what we believe might be. Use your religious freedom because you believe in love. Put freedom of conscience to work by believing, forming, and acting. Live on the outside, the way that Armando Valladares lived in prison. He describes it like this: I never asked God to get me out of here. I didn't think that God should be used for that kind of request. I only asked that he allow me to resist, that he give me the faith and spiritual strength to bear up under these conditions without sickening with hatred. I only prayed for him to accompany me, and his presence, which I felt, made my faith an indestructible shield. Thank you.
Well, I hope you learned something listening to that. This is such a deeper conversation. It's a conversation we need to be having a lot more of, and maybe this will just be the beginning of that for you. And I want to encourage you, if you want to go deeper into this principle, which I just believe is so critical for any leader right now, trying to discern how to lead your people, how to help people understand our conscience. I think all the way back at the beginning of this country, James Madison felt conscience rights were the most fundamental rights. Even in the United Nations, you see their declaration as one of the human rights, as their clauses have laid out, is the right of somebody to live by their conscience and never be coerced to do something against their conscience. So if you care about learning more about this, Becket Fund has a great podcast series that I would encourage you to tune into. You can learn more about it at becketlaw.org. That's BECKET law.org. And season 2 of their podcast called Stream of Conscience, pretty cool, pretty clever, is airing there. And you can listen to that, subscribe to that, and continue to learn more about this important idea. Thank you again for being a part of this Q Ideas community. Thank you for sharing these kinds of talks with your friends, with other leaders in your community. We're going to continue every week to try to educate you and keep you informed of how to think well about our current moment in society. And until next week, I hope you have a wonderful week.